The myth of Persephone is particularly fascinating to me. In fact, so fascinating that a part of my master's thesis was on myth, and Persephone was involved in that. The title was From Modern Prometheus to Modern Persephone, the Evolution of Archetypal Myth from Mary Shelley to Virginia Woolf. The thesis itself was only slightly longer. But Persephone interests me for several reasons. And one is the evolution of her myth throughout time. Charlene Spretnak wrote a book called Ancient Goddesses of Greece, really before it was Greece, when it was Pelasgia. When we get into Greek myth, we'll talk about Pelasgia. And she sets forth an entirely different myth of Persephone. Now this is where your sources particularly become important. Because although Spretnak gives this wonderful tale of pre-Hellenic Persephone, she doesn't give her sources. And so though it is a nice tale to read and consider, we don't know how accurate it is because she doesn't give her sources. But in her version, she says that Persephone and Demeter were mother and daughter, just like in the classical myth. And that the world was always in perpetual summer and everything was wonderful and fine. But Persephone became aware of the souls of the dead inside the earth. And it made her very sad, and she wanted to do something for them because they were just milling around in a lost state, full of despair and no hope. And so finally, she decides that she will descend into the underworld and as a result becoming a willing savior, not abducted by Hades. She wants to descend in order to help the souls in Hades. It wasn't called Hades then, it was just the underworld. And so she did. And she took with her some sheaves of wheat and some pomegranate. Yes, the pomegranate still plays a part in this. And she also took some poppies. Now the wheat was to symbolize rebirth. The poppies were for forgetfulness, because that's where we get opium, and opium dulls the senses and helps us to forget. As a matter of fact, when Odysseus goes to the land of the lotus eaters in the Odyssey, it's most often noted as being India, where they would have been smoking opium. But I digress. And the pomegranate juice in this case played a much different role than it did in the later Hellenic tales. So she had the wheat as to offer to the souls of the dead as a promise of their rebirth and regeneration. She gave them poppy juice in order to soothe them and help them forget their past. And she took the pomegranate juice and she marked each soul of the dead with this red juice. Now why? Because it is symbolic of blood. And blood is so very important. In ancient myth and modern myth as well. Blood is and was the life force. And to be without blood is to be without life. We see that in the continuing myth or legend, whichever you want to call it, of the vampire who continuously seeks out blood in order to stay alive in the undead state. And so after Persephone does all of this, and of course it takes her a very long time to anoint each dead person, then she ascends back to her mother at the top, on the surface of the earth. Now while Persephone has been down in the underworld becoming queen of the dead in her own right, Demeter, the story is the same. Demeter has mourned, and as a result of her mourning, the earth has experienced its first winter. Now, one of the big differences in this tale is that it is pre-Aryan, and Zeus and the other male gods, Olympian gods, were Aryan gods. And Aryans came down from the steppes of Russia, that is the most recent and promising story of their progression into Asia. They came down from the steppes of Russia. They were patriarchal. Again, this is something that we will look deeper into when we study Greek myth. And they brought their male gods with them. And when they went into that area, now known as Greece, then known as Pelasgia, they brought those male gods, and there was a war between the Pelasgians and the Aryans. The Aryans won, and so they instituted their male deities as preeminent. So this story that Spretnak gives is before there was a Zeus, before there was a Hades to even abduct Persephone, and Persephone was indeed queen of the dead in her own right, and not because she was ultimately married to Hades. Now, Spretnak's tale, whether it happened like that or not, or the tale, not that the tale actually happened like that, is supported by Graves and other mythologists, because we know that the Pelasgians existed, that the Titans were the gods of the Pelasgians before the Olympians ever existed in that area. And so Graves, too, says that the underworld was the domain of the goddesses. And when you see aspects of the goddesses next week, you will see how the womb is represented by caves within the earth, and how the underworld really was the provinces of the goddesses. Now, I'm not going to go into what Graves says, because it's very confusing, because he talks about Persephone, but in that role, Persephone was the crone and Hecate was the maiden. Yeah, very confusing. But the tale changes from Persephone being a willing savior, descending into the underworld to help the souls of the dead, to being a victim, abducted by Hades, and becoming an unwilling queen of the dead, only because of her being the consort of a male god. So keep Persephone in mind. She is a fascinating character. She is represented in modern myth in many ways, including Rita Dove's book-long poem about Hades and Persephone, wherein Persephone is a young woman who is lured away from her mother, not abducted by Hades, but lured away from her mother by an unsavory character. So that this myth does continue on in many ways, even until today.